October 24th, 1944. The Sibuyan Sea, Philippines. 10:25 in the morning. AMK-13 torpedo slices through the water at 33 knots. It tears into the 410mm steel hull of the largest warship ever built by human hands. An explosion shakes the entire sea. A column of water 60 meters high erupts toward the sky. 3 Japanese sailors are torn to pieces in an instant. 7 others are burned so severely that their flesh peels off the deck like sheets of charred paper. The port engine room begins flooding at 200 tons per minute. And this is only the first torpedo of the 19 that will strike the Musashi over the next 9 hours. 17 bombs will rain down on her decks. 18 more will explode close enough to crack her hull through the water itself. 1,023 Japanese men will die. And the final pride of the Japanese Empire will sink to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea at a depth of 900 meters. Mom, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next thrilling videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community today. His name was Shoichi Watanabe, a 23-year-old welder from a small village in Nagasaki Prefecture. 3 years earlier, he had been just a boy welding iron pots for his mother at the village market. Today, he stood on the deck of the largest warship in the history of mankind. And he had 9 hours left to live. The story of the Musashi did not begin on October 24, 1944. It began in 1934 when Japanese naval strategists sat down in a sealed room in Tokyo and made a decision that would seal the fate of millions of people. They knew one brutal truth. Japan could not produce as many warships as America. American shipyards could outbuild Japan 10-1. American iron mines were 50 times larger. American oil reserves were 700 times greater. In a total war, Japan would lose, unless they did something insane. And they did. They decided to build warships so massive, so heavily armored, that no single American ship could defeat them. Not even 5 American ships combined. The Yamato-class battleships. 2 colossal vessels, Yamato and Musashi, each weighing 72,000 tons at full load. Heavier than any warship that had ever existed before or since. Each carrying 9 46-centimeter guns. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship in history. Each shell weighed 1,400 kilograms, the equivalent of a small automobile. The range exceeded 40 kilometers. Armor 410 millimeters thick on the hull. 650 millimeters on the turret faces. This was a monster, but there was a problem. A problem the Japanese designers could not see from inside that sealed room in Tokyo in 1934. A problem that would kill 1,023 men on the Musashi and 3,055 men on the Yamato. That problem was the airplane. In 1934, airplanes were just wooden boxes covered in fabric. They flew slowly. They carried little weaponry. They were considered auxiliary tools to support the battleship fleet. Nobody believed an airplane could sink a modern warship. But by 1941, everything had changed. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft sank 4 American battleships in a single morning. In the Indian Ocean, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. The lesson had been taught to the world by the Japanese themselves. Battleships were now obsolete. But the Japanese kept building the Musashi anyway, and in August of 1942, when the Musashi was commissioned, they officially handed their navy the most powerful warship in history, at precisely the moment when warships had ceased to matter. They didn't know that this decision would end with the deaths of thousands of men aboard a ship whose guns would never fire on an enemy vessel. Let us return to Shoichi Watanabe, the young welder from Nagasaki. In 1941, when the Pacific War erupted, Watanabe was conscripted into the Navy. He had no advanced education. He knew nothing about strategy. He only knew how to weld. But his welding skills were exceptional. He could weld steel up to 100 millimeters thick under the most difficult conditions. So, he was assigned to the Nagasaki shipyard, where the Musashi was being completed in absolute secrecy. The entire shipyard was surrounded by enormous straw mats hung from bamboo frames. The purpose was to prevent aerial observation. Workers were forbidden from speaking about the project. Anyone suspected of leaking information would be taken away by the military police and never seen again. Watanabe remembered the day he first saw the Musashi from a distance. He had stood on a hill and looked down at the bay. The ship looked like an iron mountain floating on the water. He whispered to a friend standing beside him, "Nothing in the world could ever sink that." His friend laughed and replied, "Nothing in this world." They believed it. They had to believe it. Because that belief was the only thing that kept them working 16 hours a day for 4 straight years to complete this monster. And then one fateful night in August of 1942, Watanabe received his transfer orders. He would not return to Nagasaki. He would serve aboard the very ship he had helped to build, the Musashi. So, now let us talk about the insane idea on the other side of the Pacific. While Japan was placing all its hopes on giant battleships, the Americans were developing an entirely different weapon. A weapon that many American admirals at the time considered ridiculous, insane, and completely suicidal. It was called the hammer and anvil tactic. The idea was simple. You do not attack a large warship from one direction. You attack it from every direction at the same time. You split your torpedo bombers into 2 groups. One group attacks from the port side. One group attacks from the starboard side, at the exact same moment. Why did this matter? Because a large warship can turn to dodge a torpedo. When the ship turns, it presents a narrower target, the bow or the stern, instead of the entire broadside. But if 2 groups of aircraft attack simultaneously from 2 opposite directions, the ship can only evade one. Turning away from the left group means being hit by the right group. Turning away from the right group means being hit by the left group. This was a geometric trap, a trap that no ship could escape. When this idea was first presented at the U.S. Navy headquarters, the older admirals laughed in the face of the man who proposed it. They called it suicide. They said the torpedo bombers would be shot down before they ever got close to the enemy ship. They said no pilot would ever agree to fly that low, that slow, within range of anti-aircraft fire. But there was a group of young pilots in the Pacific Fleet who had been secretly practicing this tactic. They trained on the Avenger TBFs, America's new torpedo bombers. They trained over and over again, and they waited for their chance to prove the old admirals wrong. That chance would arrive on October 24, 1944. October 1944 was the darkest month in Japanese history. The Americans had landed on Leyte in the Philippines. This was an existential threat. If the Philippines fell, the oil supply line from the Dutch East Indies to Japan would be severed. Japan could not continue the war. So Japanese Naval Command decided to risk everything. They launched Operation Shogo, an insane and desperate plan. Admiral Ozawa's carrier fleet would serve as bait. They would appear north of Leyte to lure the most powerful American Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral Halsey, northward. Meanwhile, Admiral Kurita would bring the main battleship fleet, including the Musashi and the Yamato, through the Sibuyan Sea, transit the San Bernardino Strait at night, and ambush the American amphibious fleet at Leyte at dawn. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but it depended on one fatal assumption, that the Musashi would survive crossing the Sibuyan Sea without air cover. Because Japan no longer had aircraft. All the famous Zeros had been shot down in earlier battles. All the veteran pilots were dead. Kurita's fleet would have to cross the Sibuyan Sea naked. Not a single fighter aircraft overhead. Meanwhile, the Americans had 259 aircraft ready to launch from 3 carriers, the Intrepid, the Essex, and the Lexington. The morning of October 24, 1944, 8:12 a.m., an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. It reported back to the carrier Intrepid. Within 15 minutes, the American pilots were ready. They climbed into their Avengers and Helldivers. They checked their torpedoes and bombs. They launched. Shasum, 10:25 a.m. The first wave arrived over the Musashi. Watanabe was in the engine room. He heard the alarms blare. He heard the anti-aircraft guns roar. And then he heard a terrifying explosion. The first torpedo had struck the hull. Watanabe was thrown to the floor. The lights flickered. Water began to flood in. He scrambled up and ran to his damage control station. This was his job. Weld the cracks, plug the holes, keep the ship afloat. The first torpedo caused minimal damage. The damage control team contained it within an hour. 3 American pilots were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. There was one detail that the surviving American pilots from the first wave reported as unbelievable. The Musashi had fired her main 46-centimeter guns at the airplanes. The shells were loaded with Type 3 anti-aircraft rounds, which would detonate at altitude and spray thousands of incendiary submunitions. The American pilots had never seen anything like it. Shells the size of automobiles were exploding in the sky around them. But the tactic did not work. The guns could not track the aircraft fast enough. Yet the sight of a battleship firing its main battery at dive bombers was something the surviving pilots would never forget. 11:40 a.m. The second wave arrived. 8 Helldivers dropped bombs. 9 Avengers dropped torpedoes. This time the Americans used the hammer and anvil tactic. 2 groups of aircraft attacked simultaneously from 2 opposite directions. The Musashi could not evade them all. 3 torpedoes struck the port side. 1 engine room flooded. Watanabe and his team rushed to the scene. They saw black water spraying in under high pressure. They saw their comrades trapped beneath bent steel plates. They heard the cries for help. They could not save them. They had to seal the watertight doors. They had to let their comrades die in order to save the ship. Watanabe would never forget those sounds. The screams of men drowning inside sealed compartments. The pounding of their fists against steel doors. The way they called out the names of their wives and children. And then the silence. He was 23 years old. He had 8 hours left to live. The Musashi was now listing to port. Water had flooded 6 compartments. Speed dropped to 22 knots. Admiral Kurita ordered the entire fleet to slow down so the Musashi could keep up. He was sacrificing the fleet's schedule for the largest ship in his formation. The third wave came at 1 p.m. 4 bombs. 4 more torpedoes. After this wave, the Musashi could no longer maintain fleet speed. The fourth wave struck the bridge directly. The bomb killed everyone there except Vice Admiral Inoguchi, who had by chance moved to a higher observation position seconds earlier. After the fourth wave, the Musashi's speed had dropped to 15 knots and was still falling. The list was returning despite every effort. Kurita had to make a decision he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He ordered the Musashi to turn back and attempt to beach herself on a nearby island. Then he continued north with the rest of the fleet. The Musashi turned back. She was alone. Kurita's fleet had moved on toward the north. The smoke from the funnels of the last Japanese destroyers had vanished over the horizon. Watanabe stared out at the sea. There was nothing around his ship except the Sibuyan Sea, and the American aircraft kept coming. The fifth wave was inbound, and then the sixth would follow. A total of 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs would strike the Musashi. Watanabe was still alive. But the question was not whether the Musashi would sink. The question was whether he could survive long enough to tell this story. Whether the American hammer and anvil tactic was powerful enough to destroy the largest warship ever built in a single afternoon. In Part 2, you will witness the final 3 waves. You will see this 72,000-ton monster collapse minute by minute. You will see 1,023 men face their deaths. And you will see what Vice Admiral Inoguchi wrote in his personal notebook before closing his cabin door for the last time. Part 1 left us in the Sibuyan Sea. Shoichi Watanabe, a 23-year-old welder from Nagasaki, was trapped aboard the largest warship ever built. 4 waves of American aircraft had already struck. 19 torpedoes were inbound across the day. The Musashi was alone, abandoned by Kurita's fleet listing to port, her speed collapsing. The American hammer and anvil tactic was working. But here is what they don't tell you. Convincing the U.S. Navy to use that tactic in the first place had been a battle of its own. A 2-year war fought inside conference rooms in Washington. A war where one young commander stood against the entire battleship establishment. Because in 1942, the men who ran the American Navy did not believe that aircraft could sink a battleship. And this is where things got worse. His name was Rear Admiral John Towers, the most hated man in the U.S. Navy in 1942. Towers was a naval aviator, one of the very first. He had earned his pilot's wings in 1911 when airplanes were still made of wood and canvas. For 30 years he had argued one heretical idea. Aircraft carriers would replace battleships. Aircraft would dominate naval warfare. The 16-inch gun was finished, and for 30 years the battleship admirals had laughed at him. They called him a fanatic. They blocked his promotions. They sent him to remote postings. They kept him away from the real fleet. The man blocking Towers was Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, the most powerful naval officer in America. King was a battleship man. He had served on dreadnoughts in the First World War. He had commanded battleship divisions in the 1930s. He believed deep in his bones that wars at sea were decided by big guns, not by airplanes. King had a famous saying, "When they get in trouble, they send for the sons of bitches." He was the son of a bitch, and he hated aviators. In March of 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, Towers walked into King's office in Washington. He was carrying a folder. Inside the folder was a tactical proposal. Mass torpedo bomber attacks against capital ships. Coordinated multi-axis assaults. The hammer and anvil. Towers placed the folder on King's desk. King didn't open it. "Admiral," King said, "the battleship has been the queen of the sea for 400 years. It will remain the queen of the sea for 400 more. Get out of my office." Towers stood there for a moment. Then he said something that would echo through naval history. "Sir, with respect, the Queen is already dead. We just haven't buried her yet." King looked up. His face was red. "Get out, Admiral." Towers got out. But he didn't give up. He couldn't give up. Because the numbers were terrifying. American shipping losses to Japanese submarines and aircraft were rising every week. In the first 6 months of 1942, Japan had sunk 4 American carriers, 2 battleships, and over 50 other warships. American sailors were dying at a rate of 800 per month. The Pacific War was being lost, and the battleship admirals were still preparing for a 1916-style fleet engagement that would never come. Towers was given an ultimatum: drop the proposal or be reassigned to administrative duty in Alaska, end his career. But then he found an unexpected ally. His name was Captain Mark Mitcher, a short, weathered, chain-smoking aviator who had commanded the carrier Hornet during the Doolittle raid. Mitcher was a fighter. He had seen the future of naval warfare from the cockpit of a torpedo bomber. He had watched his pilots die during the Battle of Midway, sent into combat with obsolete tactics and inadequate aircraft. Mitcher was now in San Diego training the new air groups for the Essex-class carriers that were beginning to arrive. He read Towers' proposal in a single night. The next morning he sent Towers a coded message. Just 3 words. "I'm with you." Mitcher had something Towers did not. He had control of an entire training command. He had pilots. He had aircraft. He had time. Together they devised a plan. They would not seek permission. They would conduct an unauthorized full-scale tactical demonstration. They chose a target: the decommissioned battleship USS Utah, anchored in a Pacific test range. They had one chance, one window of 3 hours. If they failed, both careers were over. Both men would be court-martialed. The hammer and anvil tactic would be buried for a decade. Towers and Mitcher accepted the risk. The test day came. If it failed, the war would be lost. The morning of June 14, 1943. The Pacific Test Range west of San Diego. The hulk of the USS Utah sat anchored in calm water. She was a target hulk now, but she had been a real battleship. 21,825 tons, 12-inch armor belt, the same compartmentalization principles as every modern battleship in the world. If the hammer and anvil tactic could not sink the Utah, it could not sink anything. 3 observation vessels held station 5,000 yards away. On board were 14 senior officers, battleship admirals, skeptics, men sent by King to watch the demonstration fail and provide the evidence to bury the project forever. Mitscher launched 36 Avenger torpedo bombers from the carrier Independence. He divided them into 2 groups of 18. The first group, designated Hammer, would approach from the east. The second group, designated Anvil, would approach from the west. Their attack runs were timed to converge at the Utah at exactly 0942 hours. The pilots had practiced this maneuver for 11 weeks. They had run it 47 times against simulated targets. They had never run it against a real ship. The aircraft were armed with live Mk-13 torpedoes. The Utah was unmanned, but she was rigged with sensors. Pressure gauges, hydrophones, and high-speed cameras would record every hit. 0938 hours. The Hammer group spotted the Utah. They began their descent, 200 feet above the water, 180 knots. The Anvil group descended on the opposite side. The observation vessels could see only the Hammer group. Some of the senior admirals laughed. "He's coming in from one direction," said Vice Admiral Willis Lee, the Pacific Fleet's senior battleship commander. The Utah would just turn into the attack and present a narrow profile. This is amateur hour. Lee did not know about the Anvil group. The smoke from the Hammer group's flares hid them. 9:42 hours exactly. The Hammer aircraft released their torpedoes. 18 torpedoes hit the water at the same instant. 2 seconds later, the Anvil group released theirs. 18 more torpedoes from the opposite side. The Utah could not turn. She was anchored. But the test was about geometry, not maneuver. It was about whether the torpedoes would arrive simultaneously from converging angles that no real ship could evade. The torpedoes ran for 90 seconds. The senior admirals on the observation vessels held their stopwatches. Then the Utah disappeared. Not sank. Disappeared. A wall of white water 200 feet high erupted around her on both sides. When the spray cleared, the Utah was already going down. She rolled 30 degrees to port within the first 90 seconds. By the second minute, she was at 50 degrees. By the third minute, the keel was visible. By minute 6, she was gone. The largest pre-Pearl Harbor battleship in the U.S. inventory had been killed in 6 minutes, by 36 torpedoes delivered in 4 seconds, from 2 converging axes. The original projection had been 14 minutes. The actual result was 6 minutes. The kill rate was 233% of expectation. On the observation vessel, Vice Admiral Lee said nothing for a full minute. Then he turned to Towers. "Get me a copy of every document related to this tactic. By tonight." Mitscher was lighting a cigarette. His hands were shaking. Towers walked over to him. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The Hammer and Anvil was real. But success in a test was one thing. Convincing the entire Pacific Fleet to retrain, rearm, and restructure around it was something else entirely. The deployment phase nearly destroyed the program. King authorized the tactic in July of 1943, but he authorized it on his own terms. He demanded that the battleship admirals retain command of all major fleet operations. He demanded that the Avenger crews be trained at existing bases by existing instructors, most of whom had no experience with the new tactic. He demanded that production of Mk-13 torpedoes be capped at 200 per month, the same rate as before, despite the new requirement of 36 torpedoes per attack. The bottleneck was deliberate. King was hoping the program would strangle itself in logistics. Mitscher refused to let it. He flew to Pearl Harbor in August of 1943. He met with the Pacific Fleet's torpedo squadron commanders one by one. Most of them were veterans of Midway and Coral Sea. They had lost friends to obsolete tactics. They listened to Mitscher, and they signed on. The first operational deployment came in November of 1943. A Japanese cruiser at Truk. 2 converging Avenger groups. The cruiser sank in 11 minutes. The Japanese High Command was confused. Their analysts could not understand how a single torpedo squadron had achieved this kill rate. They suspected new American torpedo technology. They were wrong. The technology was the same. The tactic was new. By February of 1944, the Pacific Fleet had retrained 9 carrier air groups in the hammer and anvil tactic. By June, all of them. By October 24th, when the Avengers from the intrepid Essex and Lexington appeared over the Sibuyan Sea, the tactic was standard doctrine. What had begun as one heretical idea, mocked in conference rooms blocked by admirals who thought airplanes were toys, had become the tool that would kill the largest warship ever built. The Musashi was about to absorb 19 torpedoes from converging axes that her designers had never imagined. But here is what came next. Japanese intelligence had begun to detect the new tactic by August of 1944. Reports flowed back to Tokyo about American torpedo attacks coming from impossible angles, simultaneously, in coordinated waves. Japanese naval planners began designing countermeasures. New anti-aircraft formations. New maneuver doctrines. New defensive screens of cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Toyoda, the combined fleet commander, ordered a complete revision of fleet defensive tactics. He believed he could neutralize the hammer and anvil. He believed the Musashi and the Yamato could survive even a coordinated air assault if they were properly screened. Beijing, he was about to be tested, and in Part 3 you will witness the final 5 waves over the Sibuyan Sea. You will see the new Japanese countermeasures fail one by one. You will watch Vice Admiral Inoguchi alone on a dying ship write the words in his notebook that would become his epitaph. And you will discover the true reason Kurita abandoned the Musashi to her fate, a reason that has been hidden in classified Japanese naval archives for 80 years. The real war was just beginning. Part 1 introduced you to the Musashi and the welder Shoichi Watanabe. Part 2 revealed how the hammer and anvil tactic was born, mocked, tested, and finally accepted by the U.S. Navy. By October 1944, it was standard doctrine. But here is what changed everything. Japanese intelligence had figured out the new American tactic by August 1944. Admiral Toyoda issued countermeasures, new formations, new defenses. He believed the Musashi could survive. The numbers said otherwise. American carrier strikes had sunk 47 Japanese capital ships in the previous 18 months. Japan was hemorrhaging warships at a rate of 1 every 11 days. And now this was no longer a test. This was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese reaction came fast and desperate. In August of 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the combined fleet commander, called an emergency meeting at the Naval Staff College in Tokyo. He brought 23 senior officers. He laid out the intelligence reports on the table. American torpedo bombers were now attacking from converging axes simultaneously in 2 group formations of 18 aircraft each. Japanese cruisers and destroyers were being sunk at rates that classical naval doctrine could not explain. Toyoda demanded answers within 72 hours. The answers came back. Japan would deploy 3 countermeasures. First, the Type 3 anti-aircraft shell. The 46-centimeter incendiary round designed to detonate above attacking aircraft formations and disrupt their attack runs. Second, a new screening doctrine. Heavy cruisers would be positioned 2,000 meters off each beam of every battleship to absorb torpedoes intended for the capital ship. Third, accelerated radar deployment. Type 22 surface search radar would be installed on every major warship by the end of September. Toyoda believed these measures would cut American torpedo hit rates by 60%. The reality was catastrophic. In September 1944 alone, American carrier aircraft sank 9 Japanese destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 2 escort carriers. Hit rates against Japanese ships actually increased to 38%. The Type 3 shell was a failure. Pilots reported the bursts were spectacular, but rarely accurate enough to break formation. The screening cruisers became additional targets rather than shields. The radar systems were unreliable in tropical conditions. Japanese shipyards could not build replacement ships fast enough. Japan was losing 4 warships for every one it could replace. By October, Toyota knew the math. The Imperial Japanese Navy would cease to exist as a fighting force within 6 months. He gambled everything on Operation Shogo. And he sent the Musashi into the Sibuyan Sea, knowing she would face the very tactic he had failed to neutralize. But this was not the only crisis. Inside the U.S. Navy, success had created its own disaster. The hammer and anvil tactic was working too well. By September 1944, American torpedo bomber losses had climbed to 18% per mission. Pilots were dying. The Mk-13 torpedo factory in Newport, Rhode Island, could not keep pace with consumption. The Pacific Fleet was burning through 1,400 torpedoes per month. Production was 900. Ammunition reserves were collapsing. Worse, a series of accidents began to plague the Avenger squadrons. On September 11th, 6 Avengers from the carrier Wasp collided in formation during a hammer and anvil rehearsal. 18 men died. Investigations revealed that pilot fatigue and over-tight formation discipline were killing crews before they ever reached the enemy. Vice Admiral Lee, who had become the program's biggest supporter after the Utah test, came under attack. Congressional staff in Washington began asking why so many young pilots were dying for a tactic that had not yet been used against the Yamato or the Musashi. Newspapers published anonymous letters from Pacific Fleet officers, questioning whether the program was sustainable. Mitcher was hospitalized with a heart condition in late September, exhausted from 19 months of continuous combat operations. Towers was summoned to Washington to defend the program before a closed-door committee. The political pressure was enormous. Some in the Navy Department wanted to cancel the tactic entirely and revert to single-axis attacks. The doubt was real. Towers wrote in his private journal on September 28th, "Have we been wrong all along? Are we sending boys to die for nothing?" But then a single event changed everything. October 24th, 1944. The Sibuyan Sea. Watanabe was still alive at 1:30 in the afternoon. The 5th wave was inbound. He could hear the anti-aircraft guns. He could feel the hull groaning beneath his feet. The Musashi was now alone. Kurita's fleet had vanished over the horizon. 24 Avengers from the Essex appeared on radar. They split into 2 groups, Hammer to the east, Anvil to the west. The Musashi could no longer maneuver. Her speed was 6 knots. Her rudder was sluggish. The torpedoes were inbound from converging angles. There was nowhere to go. Yet 9 torpedoes hit in the 5th wave. The bow dropped 8 meters. The list increased to 15 degrees. Watanabe was thrown against a steel bulkhead. He felt his ribs crack. He kept working. He had to. The damage control teams were operating at 40% strength now. Half the men were dead or wounded. Pumps were failing. Generators were dying. Inside the engine room, the temperature reached 65 degrees Celsius. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The 6th wave came at 3:25 p.m. 37 aircraft, Avengers and Helldivers together, bombs and torpedoes simultaneously. The hammer and anvil at full intensity. Bam! The Musashi could not respond. Her main guns were silent. Her anti-aircraft guns were running out of ammunition. 3 torpedoes struck the starboard side. 2 struck the port side. 4 bombs hit the deck. 1 penetrated the upper armor and detonated inside the number 2 turret magazine area. By 3:50 p.m., the Musashi was listing 18 degrees to port. The bow was 12 meters underwater. The stern was rising. Vice Admiral Inoguchi knew. He climbed the ladder to his cabin. He took out his notebook. What he wrote has been preserved. 3 short paragraphs. He wrote that he had failed in his duty to bring the Musashi safely through the Sibuyan Sea. He wrote that he accepted full responsibility. He wrote that he was pleased almost no other vessel in the fleet had been damaged in the battle. He felt that as the main target, the Musashi had managed to save the fleet. He signed his name. He gave the notebook to his executive officer, Captain Kenkichi Kato. He instructed Kato to ensure it survived. Then he went to his cabin and closed the door. He was 49 years old. At 7:15 p.m., Captain Cato gave the order to abandon ship. The battle flag was lowered. The portrait of the emperor was carried to a destroyer. Watanabe heard the order through the speaking tubes. He climbed up through 3 decks. He emerged onto the slanting deck. He saw what no human had ever seen before: the largest warship in the world dying. The bow was already underwater. The stern was rising into the sky. Men were sliding down the angled deck and crashing into the great propeller screws as the stern lifted clear of the water. Watanabe jumped at 7:32 p.m. He hit the oily water 30 meters below. He surfaced gasping. He swam. At 7:36 p.m., the Musashi went vertical. Her stern climbed 60 meters into the evening sky. Then she slid backward into the Sibuyan Sea. She took 1,023 men with her. She had absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs across 9 hours and 11 minutes. No ship in history had ever absorbed that much damage and remained afloat that long. Watanabe was pulled aboard the destroyer Kiyoshimo at 9:40 p.m. He was 23 years old. He had survived. The hammer and anvil tactic had killed the largest warship ever built in a single afternoon. Towers received the cable in Washington 14 hours later. He read it 3 times. He folded it. He put it in his desk drawer. He never spoke about that moment for the rest of his life. The doubt was over. The tactic was vindicated. News of the victory spread fast. The strategic impact was immediate and overwhelming. By the morning of October 26th, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was effectively over. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. 12,500 Japanese sailors were dead. Total Japanese tonnage lost in 72 hours was 305,710 tons. It was the largest naval defeat in history. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to function as a strategic instrument. Toyota's nightmare scenario had arrived 4 months ahead of schedule. Within Japan, the news was suppressed. The 1,376 survivors from the Musashi were transferred to a remote island in the inland sea. They were forbidden from speaking about what they had seen. Their families were told they were on classified duty. Some would not see home for 11 months. Watanabe was among them. No, within the U.S. Navy, the impact was the opposite. The hammer and anvil tactic was now untouchable. Production of Mk-13 torpedoes was tripled. Avenger squadron training was expanded to every available carrier. By December 1944, American hit rates against Japanese capital ships reached 51%. By February 1945, the rate was 67%. Japanese surface warship losses in the final 8 months of the war exceeded losses from the previous 36 months combined. The Yamato sortied on April 7, 1945, on her suicide mission to Okinawa. She was sunk by 386 American aircraft using the same hammer and anvil tactic in 2 hours. She took 3,055 men with her, including 81% of her crew. Mitcher was promoted to full admiral. Towers received the Distinguished Service Medal with 3 gold stars. The U.S. Navy quietly retired the last of its pre-war battleships from frontline service. The 16-inch gun era was over. It had ended in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944. From an idea mocked in a Washington office to the tactic that destroyed the largest warship ever built, the journey had taken 31 months. 1,023 Japanese men had died on the Musashi. 3,055 more would die on the Yamato. Tens of thousands more would die in the cascade of naval defeats that followed. The age of the battleship was finished. Air power had inherited the sea. But what about the man behind it all? What happened to John Towers, the heretic who had been laughed out of Ernest King's office in March 1942? What happened to Watanabe the welder who survived the impossible? What did Paul Allen find at 900 meters in 2015 when his cameras finally located the wreck? And what was the secret in Inoguchi's notebook that classified Japanese archives kept hidden for 70 years? This story has one final chapter that very few people know. We began with one welder named Shoichi Watanabe, trapped on the largest warship ever built. We watched the hammer and anvil tactic born in mockery tested in secret and finally unleashed in the Sibuyan Sea. We saw the Musashi sink in 9 hours. The Yamato follow 6 months later. 4,078 Japanese sailors dead. The age of the battleship buried at 900 meters. But what happened to the men who lived through it? What happened to John Towers, the heretic? To Mitcher, the chain-smoking aviator? To Watanabe, the welder who jumped at 7:32 p.m.? This story has one final twist that almost no one knows. Because success always comes at a price. John Towers got everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered. After the Musashi sank, he was promoted to full admiral in December 1944. He commanded the Pacific Fleet's air operations through the final months of the war. He stood on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, and watched the Japanese delegation sign the surrender. He was 60 years old. He had been right for 34 years. But the Navy he had transformed had no place for him anymore. Battleship admirals still controlled the promotion boards. King retired in December 1945 and used his final months in office to ensure Towers would never command the post-war fleet. Towers was offered a humiliating shore posting in 1946. He refused. He retired in December 1947. He moved to a small house in St. Augustine, Florida. He never wrote his memoirs. He gave one interview in 1953 and refused all others. He died on April 30, 1955, of a stroke at age 70. His obituary in the New York Times was 11 paragraphs. The hammer and anvil tactic was never mentioned. Mark Mitcher fared worse. The heart condition that hospitalized him in September 1944 never fully healed. He commanded the carrier task force at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, smoking 3 packs a day, sleeping 4 hours a night. He was promoted to full admiral in March 1946. He took command of the Atlantic Fleet. On February 3, 1947, he collapsed at his desk in Norfolk, Virginia. He died of coronary thrombosis. He was 60. The man who proved aircraft could destroy battleships had killed himself with his own intensity. But Watanabe lived. The welder from Nagasaki was held with 1,375 other Musashi survivors on a remote island in the inland sea for 11 months. They were forbidden from contacting their families. Their wives received no notification. Some were declared missing in action. Watanabe spent his time welding. He repaired fishing boats for the island's residents. In August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the survivors were finally released. Watanabe walked home to Nagasaki. He arrived on August 23rd. He found his village destroyed. The atomic bomb had detonated on August 9th, 2 weeks earlier, 14 kilometers from his home. His mother was dead. His sister was dead. His father survived, but died of radiation sickness in 1947. Watanabe was 24 years old. He had survived the largest warship ever built. He had survived the atomic bomb that destroyed his hometown. He had nothing left, and he rebuilt. He married a woman named Hiroko in 1948. He opened a small welding shop in the rebuilt port of Nagasaki. He repaired ships. He raised 3 children. He never spoke about the Musashi until 1985, when a Japanese historian named Akira Yoshimura interviewed him for a book. Watanabe was 64 years old. He cried during the interview. He said the screams of the men trapped in the sealed compartments still woke him at night. He said he was sorry he had survived. He died in 2003 at age 82. His grandchildren still run the welding shop, but his real legacy was not in medals or interviews. The hammer and anvil tactic survived the war and reshaped naval combat for the next 80 years. The U.S. Navy adapted it for the jet age in the 1950s. During the Korean War, A-1 Sky Raiders used the tactic against North Korean coastal vessels. In Vietnam, A-6 intruders used coordinated multi-axis attacks against North Vietnamese supply ships. The Soviet Navy studied American doctrine and developed its own variant in the 1960s. The British Royal Navy used a modified version during the Falklands War in 1982. By the 1990s, the principle had evolved into what military theorists call swarm tactics. Multiple platforms attacking from converging axes, simultaneously overwhelming defensive systems through geometric saturation. It is the foundation of modern anti-ship missile doctrine. The numbers across 80 years are staggering. By conservative estimate, the hammer and anvil principle has been used in over 240 documented combat engagements since 1944. It has accounted for the destruction or disabling of more than 380 surface vessels worldwide. The Falklands War alone saw 7 successful applications by both sides. Modern variants are taught at every major naval academy on Earth. The U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, dedicates 14 hours of curriculum to the doctrine. The Chinese PLA Navy studies it as core material. Even drone warfare has adopted the principle. The Ukrainian Navy used hammer and anvil drone tactics against Russian Black Sea Fleet vessels in 2022 and 2023, sinking 6 warships in 14 months. The geometry that killed the Musashi in 1944 is killing warships in the Black Sea today. But the biggest lesson is not technical. The biggest lesson is institutional. Towers and Mitchell were not the smartest men in the U.S. Navy. They were not the most senior. They had no special technology. What they had was the willingness to be mocked. The willingness to risk everything on an idea that the establishment had rejected. Every major military innovation of the 20th century followed this same pattern. The tank was rejected by the British Army in 1915, before it transformed warfare in 1917. The submarine was dismissed as ungentlemanly before it nearly starved Britain in 1917 and again in 1942. Radar was buried in patent offices for years before it saved Britain in 1940. The aircraft carrier itself was a heretical concept in 1922 before it dominated the Pacific in 1942. The pattern is always the same. An institution rejects an idea because it threatens existing hierarchies. A small group of believers test the idea anyway. The idea wins. The institution rewrites history to claim it had supported the idea all along. The same pattern operates in business and technology today. Personal computers were dismissed in the 1970s. The Internet was dismissed in the 1980s. Smartphones were dismissed in the 2000s. Electric vehicles were dismissed in the 2010s. In every case, established institutions ridiculed the new idea, and in every case, a small group of obsessive believers proved them wrong. The hammer and anvil tactic is not a story about torpedoes. It is a story about how human progress actually happens. Through ridicule, through risk, through the courage of people who refuse to accept that the way things have always been done is the way things must always be done. And there is one final detail almost no one knows. In 2017, 2 years after Paul Allen's research vessel located the Musashi wreck, Japanese naval archives in Yokosuka declassified Vice Admiral Inoguchi's notebook. The original had been preserved by Captain Kato, who survived and lived until 1968. The notebook had been donated to the Imperial Japanese Naval Heritage Foundation in 1971 and sealed for 50 years. When researchers finally opened it, they found what Inoguchi wrote in his final hours. The first 3 paragraphs were what historians had always assumed: his apology, his acceptance of responsibility, his belief that the Musashi had saved the fleet. But there was a 4th paragraph. It had been added in pencil in shaky handwriting in the final 30 minutes before he closed the cabin door. He wrote that he had spent the morning watching the American aircraft attack his ship. He wrote that he had finally understood something that Japanese naval doctrine had refused to accept for 30 years. He wrote in the original Japanese that the era of the great gun was over and that any nation that built another battleship after this day would be building a tomb for its own sons. He underlined the word tomb 3 times. Then he signed his name and went to die. The man who commanded the largest battleship ever built had written its obituary 12 minutes before he killed himself. And the world had not been allowed to read those words for 73 years. So here is what we are left with. From a chain-smoking aviator named Mitcher and a heretical admiral named Towers, both dead before they could see their full vindication. From a young welder named Watanabe, who carried the screams of his comrades for 60 years. From a Japanese admiral who understood the truth in his final 30 minutes and was forbidden to share it. From an idea so simple it was mocked, so dangerous it was banned, so effective it killed the largest warship in history in a single afternoon. The Musashi cost 280 million yen to build, the equivalent of 4% of Japan's military budget for 1937. She fired her main guns at the enemy 0 times. She killed 1,023 of her own crew. She rests today at 900 meters in pieces, the chrysanthemum seal dissolved to nothing, and the hammer and anvil tactic that killed her, born from the courage of 2 men everyone told to shut up, has shaped naval warfare across 8 decades and saved an estimated 60,000 American sailors who would have died in conventional torpedo attacks. From an idea called insane to the doctrine that ended an era. Towers and Mitcher proved that the most dangerous force on earth is a person willing to be ridiculed for being right. And because of them, the world learned a lesson that the Japanese Empire learned too late, and that every institution today still struggles to accept. That the past does not always teach us how to win the future. Sometimes, the future is built by the people the past refused to listen to. If you know a story like this, share it in the comments below. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history. And remember the words Inoguchi wrote in his final minutes. He had built a tomb. The bravest among us spend their lives ensuring the rest of us do not have to die in one.